I would say out of the entire history of the world, all the different decades of 19th century and how quickly things evolved of 100 years, I would say the 1980s between the 1910s and the 1990s definitely stood out to me the most. I feel like it would be the first thing you would look at if you look at some sort of poster card of every single decade since that time. There's a bit of things that I want to talk about for this video. Everything about the 80s was very tacky, creative, and expressive, more so than I would say even the 70s. Music changed, television changed, and culture ultimately changed as a whole. Since the 1960s and 70s, it was really the first era where the modern world started to suffice. And if we were to mark the start of the modern era, as in technology, computers, and the way that we behave now, I would say the 1980s was the closest to that. I would say the hallmark of the 80s is Vaporwave, rather the influence of Vaporwave. Even though Vaporwave wasn't really a genre that existed until 2008, it's still interesting to look back why we really loved the 80s to begin with. I think a lot of the reason why it became that way is because a lot of the furniture and architecture of the 80s was very interesting. And also, a lot of us grew up in those time periods of, even if you were born in the early 2000s, you still probably had a giant box TV. If you were old enough, smart TVs weren't exactly that widespread yet, or even smartphones, and maybe an old ugly rug that we still haven't gotten rid of, or old furniture or appliances, that kind of stuff that we still haven't replaced back then in the early 2000s. However, true 80s furniture is very blocky, it's very geometric, and very colorful. Even rug patterns and wall patterns were geometric, down to the way that lights and lamps and desks and tables looked, and the way that we even sat in them. Some of them looked actually quite uncomfortable to sit in. And almost the grainy feel of the film cameras that took them, all replicated to the liminal space look that we get in a lot of photos. Try to replicate that same dingy feeling. I wouldn't say that was an accident. Another thing about the 80s was it had some of the best movies of Hollywood of all time. Most of the movies I think about were from that period. You had 3 of the Indiana Jones movies, which are some of my favorite films of all time. You had Star Wars, which was a trilogy as well. And then you had thriller, drama, Back to the Future, again, another trilogy. Batman 1989, Roger Rabbit, also I like that movie. The Thing. Going away from movies, you also had a lot of arcade games. It was really the first time that people started to experiment, and the idea of video games became something popular, even if it was a pay-to-play sort of thing. It was just normal because it was an experience that was short-lived. You could compare it to how we use AI now, where you have to pay maybe $1 for each AI image, was not a huge fan of, but it goes into that same principle. I would say the video games of the 1980s also were really what started the evolution of modern video games. And I'm not the first person to say that, but if we were to point out even the most popular games, as in Mario or Donkey Kong, they're still relevant today. It's pretty insane how well these games have actually held up, and that Nintendo still has a huge influence on the way that we play games. Also, Japan was very aesthetically pleasing at the time, since they're one of the most technologically advanced countries. Nintendo was one of the highest marketers when it came to branding video games, such as Legend of Zelda, the original one in 1986. Heck, even Tetris. I thought Tetris was in the 90s. And even horror movie vibes. So much of horror comes from the 80s as well. You know, I'm something of a horror fan myself. There just were vibes to it that can't really be replicated in today. Even if we tried to, it just wouldn't feel the same, even in the horror genre. That's what I liked about the movies from that period, is they felt like a one-of-a-kind thing that can't really be replicated. And the fact that we used practical effects, and I mean, there was CGI, but it was dog shit. Practical effects are always going to look real because they are actually real things. They're not things that we created on computer. sort of like George Lucas tried doing and did it pretty poorly with The Phantom Menace in 1999. No. With Millennium Falcon and the Death Star, those were actual models that had to be created, and even in Blade Runner, there was a full entire city set for the city to make it look grandiose and real, and I honestly dig that, and I wish movies would do that more today. We're starting to head back into that direction, but we're not quite there yet. One of the first music genres I also had listened to was metal. Shit, I forgot what I was gonna say. That seemed like the time where if you were to be a metal band, heck, you would get big at that time, I swear. Even if it was Guns N' Roses all the way to Metallica or Slayer, Black Sabbath, which was still popular at that time. If you completely switch the card and go to Michael Jackson or Prince, there's all sorts of music variety that you could enjoy, and there was also hip-hop and Queen and David Bowie. I told you it was a very expressive time to begin with, and I think since the 1960s it became more expressive in the way that people dressed and the way that people looked, and even the way that music sounded. It was a new door that swung open that previously was not there. I would wonder if in the movie, or the book rather, 1984, if the Nazis, for example, had won, would we be something more like that, or a Clockwork Orange? Maybe the influences would still be there, but the world would be more so like the 50s, where it was idealistic and still very corporate, and the way that expression looked, or at least major expression. I don't think we think about those things because I think sometimes we take for granted that we have the rights to express ourselves more so than ever in, the 2020s. Just previously wasn't there until about 60 years ago. It was a really important thing for these historical events to happen. I mean, heck, the Cold War was going on in the 1980s, and we were still able to manage the shit out of our lives more so than we are now. It took a long time for us to evolve as a species, but I think that decade was special because it was really the first decade that felt like the modern era. Okay, I guess there's no such thing as you don't just go from 0 to 10. I get that. But it felt like the first time where things changed drastically in every way possible. If there's an older person in my comment section that wants to talk about or share their experiences, I would happily encourage you to do that, because I am young as hell. I was born in the early 2000s, so I didn't grow up in that time, and I would like to hear someone's experience and opinion of someone who did grow up at that time. Other than that, that's all I have to say, and I'll see you all in the next video. See ya!